So this is basically how a ball joint press works. You have a threaded rod that screws into the bottom. Then you have a bottom cap, okay, and it has a little space for this rod to slide into so that it's firm there. Okay, then you have this centerpiece. Okay, so as you're pushing the ball joint up or down, depending on if it's upside down on your car or not. Some of them are pointed up, some are pointed down. But basically you're pushing on the bottom of the ball joint and you're pushing it into this hollow space. Okay, so you want this on the bottom of the ball joint. You take off the C-clamp so that the ball joint can move. Take that out, and then on the bottom of the ball joint you'll be pushing as you thread that in. It should be shoving the ball joint up into this hollow space. So this piece here locks in to the top like so. Okay, so that locks into the top space there, and then this locks in there. So as you're pushing it, it's going in there. Now you have to have this dead straight, because if not, the more pressure you put here, it'll slide. It'll come off the top like that. Okay, and the problem I had with mine is my ball joint was too big where it wouldn't go into the space. Okay, this was too shallow. So what I had to do, I was doing all kinds of stuff to try to move this around and have the ball joint threads come up through the top of this and reposition over here, and it really just wasn't working. So I actually just took my control arm off, went in and had a shop press it out and press the new one in. But if you're going to use one of these ball joint presses, then this is basically how they work. If you rent one of these, make sure that this threads. I wasted a lot of time because somebody else jacked up the threads. I got everything apart, went to use it, and it wouldn't even thread 2 or 3 in. So while you're at the store, thread them in. Be very cautious about this. Make sure that you get one that's long enough. This one was too short. And then the diameter on this, it gives you a few options. Okay. The size I happen to need was right in between, where if I use this middle one, it was on the ball joint, so that didn't do any good. And this bigger one was over it and wobbling around. So just be careful with these kits when you buy them or rent them. Now here's the ball joint press that you can rent from the auto parts store, but there's 2 problems with it. And eventually it was just too much of a hassle. That's why I just took my control arm off the car, took it in, and had it, had the old ball joint pressed out and the new one pressed in. So the first problem, be careful when you're renting these from a store, because I rented the first one and the threads were jacked up, and I didn't even think twice about it when I was there. So if you rent one, make sure you run this thing through the, screw it in and make sure that it threads. It was a big waste of time for me to have to drive back, return this one, then drive across town to their other store and then get this one, which still didn't work. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Second of all, these are the problem. This is the spacer that you need, but the ball joints, at least on the Infiniti G35, stick way up past this. They probably stick out of this about that far. So you really don't have, this needs to be a wider piece. And some of the kits are that way, but this was way too small, so it wasn't working. Because when you put these ends on it, you put one end on the top as a cap, and then you stick it in between the C-clamp, and then you stick this other end on the bottom of the C-clamp. Well, these are meant to lock in to the bottom of the C-clamp and the top of the C-clamp. And the problem I had is, if you look at these, one of these has a very big hole on the top, and so I had to use that one as the top piece so that the ball joint threads, the post, could come through it, because it was so small, since this was not wide enough. And so I was using the pieces on the opposite sides just to try to make this work. And when you do that, you need a lot of clamping force. And as I was trying to get that, the whole thing just started sliding. And it was sliding, one, because the next problem, they don't have a size that's in between these two, and that's what you need on the Infinity. Okay, so this one was too small, this one was too big, and it's so big that it's just walking around and not firm, you know, around the ball joint. If you try to use this one, it appears that it will fit, but it'll sit on the ball joint, and all you'll be doing is working against yourself. So you have to be very careful about that. So I'd be very careful when you go to rent one of these. Make sure that this is actually a longer piece. You know, it needs to be, you know, longer than your finger, or about the same size as your finger. And I know we all have different size hands, but you know, just it has to be longer. And if you can, get one that has other sizes here. So this brand that does not work, just so that you know if you're doing an Infinity or if 350Z, was this EverTough. Okay, so be very careful about that.